cyber predators, grooming, and digital exploitation. The threats facing children in Malaysia's online space are as pervasive as they are alarming. Despite laws like the Child Act 2001 and the Sexual Offences Act Against Children 2017, the question remains, are we doing enough to protect our most vulnerable? And will Malaysia's proposed Online Safety Bill and the Communications and Multimedia Act be a solution or a mere promise of legislation? Welcome to Bernama World. I'm NADIAH LATIF. Today we delve into the critical issue of online child safety in Malaysia, the legal framework and its gaps. Joining me are SHARMILA SEKARAN, Chairperson of Voice of the Children, and NALINI ELUMALAI of Article 19. Thank you so much for being with us, ladies. Now let's get straight into it. SHARMILA, considering the rising online threats of grooming, exploitations, and the list goes on, how effective is the current legal framework in Malaysia? We know we have the Child Act, we have the SO Act 2017, but does it require urgent revision?
Well, like you rightly pointed out, NADIAH, children are accessing the internet at far younger ages. We've got children from the age of 9 accessing the internet, and much must be done to ensure their safety in using the internet and social media apps. You mentioned 2 acts, but in addition to them, there's the Penal Code and also, the Multimedia Commission codes and acts related to that. So yes, there are a lot of acts that protect children, but the main act in this regard, in terms of sexual offences, is really SOAC. And SOAC is quite comprehensive and explicit with regards what sexual offences are against children, including online sexual offences, and the penalties that come with them. Yes, all these acts can be strengthened, particularly CMA, the Communication Multimedia Act, can be strengthened, the Penal Code as well as the Child Act can be strengthened in this regard. But really, I think what is severely lacking is enforcement. So, we repeatedly hear of the number of online cases of sexual offences against children, internet abuses. The police have received, almost 100,000 over a period of time, almost 100,000 independent individual ISPs where sexual activity has been taking place. CSAM, child sexual abuse material, and but they've only prosecuted 50 people, and out of those 50,
out of those thousands, they've only prosecuted 50.
Over 93,000, only 100 were investigated, just over 100, and only 50 individuals were prosecuted. And out of the 50 prosecuted, we don't know how many were sentenced. So, this shows a severe lack in terms of both police resources, but also capacity in investigating, charging, and sentencing.
So the whole ecosystem has got kinks in the process. We're going to go back into how we're going to be able to implement and enforce these laws. But Nalini, I want to go to you. Malaysia's upcoming Online Safety Bill, and I know the CSOs have been talking a lot about it, and you've also had a lot of stakeholder engagements with platforms, etc. But this much anticipated bill has been discussed as a potential solution for online harms. But in your opinion, how can it provide a robust enough framework if we're going to combat specific threats for children online? And of course, she's given examples of online threats, cyberbullying, sexual harms, etc. Thoughts?
Okay, I just want to begin by saying that this is a legitimate concern from the government about the safety of children, also everyone on online, right? And the concern is legitimate. We also have the similar concerns as well. We don't want people to see some of the freedom of expression activists and CSOs as horrible human beings just to talk about freedom of expression. But the reason why we want to talk about freedom of expression, because we want to find the balance, because end of the day, any legislation that we are putting forward in our country, it has to be rooted with the human rights principle. That should be the core of any legislations, and then we have to talk about the other issues, right? And I think, of course, the online safety bill, we were invited for a couple of consultations for sure, and we thank government for doing that, although the consultation could be more and meaningful. But what has been given to us so far, what we have seen so far, is still lack of so many things, so many issues, because we want the government to really deal with the systemic issues of social media platform, not just the content moderations. So the systemic issues, like for example their algorithm, how their algorithm is amplifying, for example, children's sexual
Abuse
materials,
absolutely.
or hate speech or hateful narrative, right? We want government to look into that, and we want the social media companies also take responsibility, but also accountable and transparent in that process as well. But what we have seen so far, and we have given this feedback directly to the government as well, and we have not seen what we want to see. The secondly, I really want to push here is also, while we are talking about online safety, right? Yeah, it's online, there are so many things going on. But what we are not talking about in this conversation is like how we want to address some of the root causes of this problem. We are not addressing that. We can't just shift the responsibility to social media companies saying that you take care of it. You can't do that. You can't wash your hands, because for me, these are the rooted problem. It existed even before social media companies. We have to address cyberbullying. We have to address the power positions that we have in like between man and woman, children, and so on and so forth. I think we need to address that while we're talking about online safety, because online and offline should be safe at the same time.
Absolutely, I think Nalini has raised some really important, pertinent issues, because there are drivers for this. Some of them are socioeconomic, some of them are just power dynamics, and to really to meaningfully address this, rather than just at the surface, we really need to delve into the core drivers, the core issues, and work towards resolving that, including in sexual reproductive health education of children. We shy away from this, doing it meaningfully. And I know there have been a lot of studies in terms of SRH, right? Sexual reproductive health. A lot of children say they're either not being given the education, or it's not being done in a way that means much to them, so they prefer learning from the internet. And because they're learning from the internet, they're learning the wrong things. They're not learning how to manage it. And what we're also seeing is that the laws are not taking into account the child's maturity, the evolving maturity of children, the evolving psychological and social development of a child. It doesn't take all that into account, right? So we're just like touching the surface and saying, look, let's address these things, these issues, CSAM particularly, but the drivers, the causes are not being addressed.
So CSAM here is basically child sexual exploitation materials online. And I love the fact that both of you brought up some really pertinent points. One is the fact that if we do have legislation, we're talking about building an ecosystem of what's the end game that we want to see in Malaysia, right?
Yeah.
What is the kind of behaviors that we want to see in society, instead of looking at punitive or regressive measures, or sort of like hand slaps when some things are wrong. But what are the kind of, we call it sasiah, right? Sasiah rakyat. Like what are the type of society that we want to build moving forward? And I think it's important that you've also pointed out the fact that you mentioned algorithms, and you've mentioned about how children have to also understand maturity. Information may not necessarily be fact, and then fact is then also spliced with context and the understanding of nuance, cultural, religious issues here. Now, we spoke about this in Parliament yesterday, Sharmila, and you raised this, of course, with the MPs on why, when we're talking about online safety protection, clear definitions are important, because without that, not only is enforcement going to be difficult, but the whole conversation of how we're going to be building this ecosystem is going to be difficult all round. So ladies, we know that the Communications and Multimedia Act has been criticized on many fronts as being inadequate. But can you explain a little bit about why these vague definitions are going to be dangerous, not only the fact that it hinders law enforcement, but in effectively tackling incoming and existing threats for child online protection?
I think first of all, of course, we have a lot of issues with CMA. We have been telling this for many years, and even the current law that we have is quite problematic. It does not meet any of the international standard of freedom of expression. It doesn't fit into any of the limitation of freedom of expression. And when we go into the content, and when the definitions and 211 and 233, and they have added on what we already have a problem to. the question is like how you define grossly offensive. Now under the grossly offensive they have put hate speech, for example. Hate speech doesn't even have a unified definition under the human rights law, then how you define it, right? And hate speech is a completely a different problem because it comes from a place of discrimination, right? And how you deal with it. You can't just remove the content when you don't change the behavior. People are going to do the same thing as well. And what we have found in the current amendments, like I'll give you an example what will happen when we have a vague definitions, right? Then the social media companies will now have to remove so many contents because they don't have any direction of the clear direction of the definitions, right? What will happen is like when we ask them to remove every content, they will be busy removing content and they can let go genuinely problematic or contents that need attention. So while you are busy doing this, you actually genuine contents, a problematic, dangerous content, you are unable to see it, and that will be too late when we want to take action. Probably there are already some issues already be happening, people already be in danger, or children will be in danger. That will be the worst case scenario that could happen. And that's why we've been proposing for so many years to the government, look into the UN framework that we always touch on, the Rabat Plan of Action, where it says how to identify what is hate speech, what is freedom of expression. Follow that framework and you can actually train the officers, MC or anyone, train them how to identify freedom of expression, legitimate lawful contents and illegal contents. That is what we needed now, and we've been proposing to government for many years, and I hope they will listen to this, because you can't have vague definitions and you're talking about safety online, but which one you want to, like which category of content you want to save, right? Or
you're not talking about silencing ideas completely, but how do we have a healthy discourse, because there are problems in society that need to be discussed, and they might be thorny issues that are not necessarily. I think part of the challenge is what's hateful or what's contentious in one society might not be in another. And what's sensitive in another culture might not be one.
What is moral to me is not necessarily is a similar, similarly we have same values, right? People are different, people are unique, we all have different kind of emotions, we have different
triggers as well,
and we express differently, right? What we as a freedom of expression advocates, we keep on telling this, like in any society, if you want to have a society that growing, mature, society that well informed, you need to have the space people to talk about issues that you think sensitive. Not necessarily everything is sensitive, right? So we shouldn't internalize that fear into people. Let's people have the conversation, and because I'm very confident Malaysians can have a civilized discussion when we allow.
It's building that maturity of thought. Sharmila, from a context of child protection.
Yeah, so absolutely. But even for children, freedom of expression is necessary, because more and more we want children to participate in the national discourse, in issues that affect them. And if we're constantly looking at ways to curb freedom of expression, freedom of speech, also the freedom of thought, then you're actually limiting and impeding the growth of a child, the development of a child, and the child's maturity. So freedom of expression, while we want to protect children, we also need to ensure that they have a safe space to raise ideas and to learn how to utilize those ideas, how to advocate and speak out those ideas without fear of punishment. One of the big problems with the CMA is that it's severely punitive. There's no restorative justice model, in particular for children. There's also no, like when we're talking about CSAM, there needs to be a weightage of the kind of material that we determine as CSAM. And Codeine, the international community, have already come out with a rating system. There are about, I think, 10 different levels of child sexual abuse material, from kind of quite not very severe to grossly indecent and quite ugly images. And we need to be able to rate that, because children are also innocently sexting and sharing images. And I think we need to protect them.
When we talk about this, we often assume that the perpetrators are adults, or the ones that are in question are adults. But the reality of it is, in Malaysia, the number of online profiles are probably more than the number of people that we have. We know platforms like TikTok, Meta, IG, not so much Facebook, are very much used now, and the producers on the content creators are children themselves.
So it's child against child. So how do we clarify this, and how do we rectify a child perpetrator and bring them to the right way of thinking.
Yeah. And also distinguish, right, between children and adults, and your action should be based on, because children are more vulnerable, we all agree with that. So the special consideration, special approach should be a more like better approaches than the adults, right? And I think we need to distinguish, because in the current CMA amendment, if you see the punitive measure, that the sanctions has been increased, the question we always ask, like, what if the offender is a child under 18 years old? Takan you want to put them 10 years jail?
And we've already seen this with a SOAC, you know, the Sexual Offences Against the Child Act, where we were told at the time that the bill was being drafted and tabled in Parliament, we were told that they would not go after the child perpetrator, you know, the Sama Suka Sama cases, right? Child love cases. But what we're seeing is a lot of children going into Sekolah Tunas Bakti, a lot of children being charged, and these are good children apart from the fact that they fell in love.
So as a result of SOAC, with all good intentions, we're seeing more children now in Sekolah Tunas Bakti as we had originally intended. So this is sort of like an unintended consequences of having a very sort of punitive look at the law.
And that's our concern about CMA, because it doesn't distinguish. There's also no avenue or opportunity to mediate some of these things. And when we look at the wording of CMA, a lot of it turns on sentiments. You know, it's whether a person feels that they've been violated in some way, right? That they've been harassed, for example. But whether there was an intent to harass or not is not considered. So, you know, these are some of the things that can actually be discussed and mediated.
Definitely, and I think intention is just as important. Let's look at the other countries that are in the region, right? Sharmila, looking at the approaches that we know that has been undertaken by countries like perhaps Singapore or even the Philippines, what specific strategies do you think Malaysia can adopt or learn from, or in fact even incorporate it? Because we see a lot of the issues that are happening right now are transboundary. Anything online, if I click today and you're in Machu Picchu, you're going to be able to get it, right? So now the question is, how can we learn from what's happening abroad, or at least within the region, and knowing that Malaysia is hosting ASEAN next year, what are some of the things that we can do regionally to enforce some of the things that we need to do?
I think there needs to be a much more collaborative approach, both between the enforcement agencies, and like I said earlier, enforcement in Malaysia is quite lacking. There can be a lot more sharing of information, of knowledge, of collaboration between the enforcement agencies, also with the service providers. They are tech experts, you know, and a lot of this information, a lot of the sharing of these images, CSAM images, is happening on the dark web.
Yes.
So, you know, having cooperation between the enforcement agencies and the service providers, who are the tech experts and have very, very high level tech experts within their sphere, their environment, to root out a lot of the CSAM material and actually block it from coming into the online space would be core. But also, I think there needs to be a two-prong approach. One is the enforcement and the blocking of information, but it's also, we need to consider why people are accessing this information. And if you look in Malaysia, we're the second highest accessors after Brunei.
Second highest accessors of?
Child abuse material.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
We're one of the highest in Asia. And even within the state, you can actually see within the breakdown of our states, which states are accessing the higher amount of child abuse material. So, you know, we need to understand why people are accessing these materials, and what we can do, therefore, what are the drivers that are driving them to access the material? What do we need to do to actually stop them from accessing it? You know, because if there's no demand, there will be no supply as well, right? So instead of just blocking the supply, let us look at how we can actually stop the demand as well.
Look at it upstream and see what are the real drivers and levers that are causing these sort of behaviors. Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. Nalini, you were going to add something to it.
I think the collaborative. I think whenever we want to tackle very important issues. We can't just think about law, we can't just think about legislations and punitive actions. We really need to dwell into the real issues, right? Like what I was saying, probably we need to learn from other countries what are the public awareness campaign they are doing, what are the things they're doing on the ground to educate people, to educate children, to educate boys, girls and everyone. I think that we should learn from others. If we don't have it yet, I think we need to start having that now, because end of the day, whatever that happening offline have lot of impact online. And it's not just because we are not living in a two different world, we are living in a one world. It's just that we spend more time like in our smartphone and everything, but in real world there are a lot of other issues that's still there. And I think we need to really look into the public awareness. I think that is the most important.
We haven't
advice to parents as well, right?
We haven't even started talking about cancel culture. Like when we're talking about the threats that children are facing online today, I dare say that as a parent myself, half the things that children are talking about, we're just playing catch up. The acronyms that are coming out, you spoke about the dark web. The realities of it as children accessing the dark webs are a lot more than perhaps adults understanding how to even use the web, right? So we're playing catch up here, and it's distressing to know that the children that we are trying to protect the most are also the ones that are often very vulnerable. Parents who might watch unsavory materials and not knowing how to cover their cookie crumbs have got also children exposed to watching highly sexualized content, for example, and I've seen this firsthand in many of the states. We're not even going to say where, right? So Sharmila, how do issues like, for example, top it up with other vulnerabilities like perhaps persons with disability or poverty or socioeconomic dynamics, right? How does this impact the effectiveness of our intention of trying to get better online safety measures if you double down with all these other issues that are at play?
So I think there needs to be a lot more awareness among the parents. We need to do a lot more public awareness campaigns, what Nalini was talking about. But really also, we have to remember that a lot of the parents we're talking about are quite illiterate. They are illiterate in terms of reading and writing. Let's not even talk about IT literacy, right? And online literacy. I've got a nephew who, with a flick of a finger, can just close down a page that he's on, and I know he's not accessing any bad content, but he's not supposed to be playing games or chatting with friends, and with a flick of a finger he can just close that down. If parents are not aware, now I have made myself aware of this because of the work I do with children, but if parents are not aware, and a lot of them are not, a lot of them are very busy, children are able to get won over their parents. Like you said, we're all playing catch up. We're playing catch up not just in terms of IT, but in terms of the world we're living in. Parents used to be able to leave work behind when they came home. Today you can't. So the supervision of children is less. Coupled with that is the high cost of living and increasing. Less access to external support. You can't afford maids these days because of the cost of having home help and availability. So, there are a lot more pressures on a parent. We are expecting parents to take control of and supervise their children in some of this, but they don't have the knowledge. In terms of poverty, often the family is sharing one device. So you're right, parents are accessing unsavory content and then giving that same device to the child for
who
online
can flick that one button and go back to that document, right?
Exactly. So these are some of the things that we really need to consider, whether we need, for example, within the more rural communities, the poorer communities, urban and rural poor, B40 communities, centers that children can go to access, to use computers and access online, where there are supervisors, people who can teach them safety, online safety. I speak to children who tell me they know everything there is, and very often they know more than we do because they're being taught certain things in school. But again, is our education system equipped to teach children about online safety? I know it's happening in the private schools, but are our public schools on par as well? I seriously doubt it, because many children don't access. Don't
And
have
you brought up a
access.
very important point. It's not just about telling the information, whether there is an understanding of when we're talking about how do we behave online. Whenever we talk about rights, we're also talking about responsibility.
Yeah.
So yes, they have the right to access online platforms for education, for leisure, for communication, participation. But what does that mean in terms of having the responsibility to regulate behavior, have your space for freedom of expression, but at the same time have the respect for others, for thought, for safety, etc. Now I wish we can have a longer conversation with you ladies, but unfortunately that's all the time that we have today. Thank you, Sharmila and Nalini,
Thank
for
you so
sharing
much.
your profound insights into the pressing issue of online safety and of course children in Malaysia as we face a dynamic digital world fraught with risk. It's essential that our legal frameworks evolve and protect our youngest and most vulnerable in society. Now, this provides a real protection to empower communities, as both of you mentioned, not just after the thought, but how do we build a society that protects itself, watches out for each other, and has the correct responsibilities and behavior when we interact online as well as in person. So thank you for joining us today. Don't forget to stay safe and be kind.